The sky turned the color of wine. A girl stood motionless by the train tracks, as if the world had gone silent just to honor her last decision. But then, a hoof print appeared in the puddle by her feet. No sound, no presence. Just a perfect imprint of something no one had ever truly seen, but everyone had felt. And in that moment, as red dust began to rise into the sky, death took a step back. This isn't a story about a horse. This is a story about those who came to the edge and learned how to live again. If you're searching for stories that heal, haunt, and hold you, hit subscribe now and don't miss a single frame of what's coming next. Under a bleeding sky, the suburbs of Vancouver lay still. From above, the world was painted in shades of rust. Rooftops shimmered beneath a thin film of crimson dust, and the trees, normally so green in early May, bore an eerie red hue that made them look like monuments to something forgotten. The rain wasn't really rain, not in the traditional sense. It floated down in microscopic particles, soft as mist and heavy with presence. The kind of rain that coated the tongue with the taste of metal and memory. A slow, deliberate tracking shot revealed the streets below. People in dark raincoats shuffled through the morning hush, some hurrying with scarves over their faces, others pausing, staring at their own arms, as if questioning what had landed there. No one spoke. No one laughed. No one even ran. It was as if the entire neighborhood had signed a silent agreement to keep whatever was happening contained. A radio in a bakery window mumbled over the soft scratch of static. Confirmed not harmful, a rare phenomenon possibly linked to a pollen bloom traveling from Central Asia. Authorities say it poses no threat to health. A man sweeping his doorstep paused, lifted his head, a long breath, then whispered just out of frame, low and almost reverent. Someone saw it again. The white horse, running across the rooftops last night. Cut to a woman in a bathrobe, hair still damp from a morning shower, pressing her face to the glass of her apartment window. Her eyes scan the skyline, then stop just for a second on a distant rooftop. Nothing there. Nothing but the blood-colored mist. And yet her hand doesn't leave the glass. Inside a modest, once vibrant townhouse at the edge of the forest, everything stands still. The walls are lined with canvases, many half-finished. Acrylic smudges on the floor. Brushes like broken fingers, spilling out of jars. At the center of the room, surrounded by silence, sits Moira. She doesn't move. Her posture is not slouched, not rigid, just suspended. Like a painting that no one had the nerve to complete. 18 years old. Though today, she looks older. Her hair is tied in a knot that's falling apart. Her clothes are clean, but wrinkled like they were washed without purpose. Most striking of all are her eyes, gray, not due to color, but to absence. They stare through the empty canvas in front of her, through the walls, through time. Behind her from the kitchen, the sound of water boiling. Then soft sobbing, the kind that tries to stay hidden. Her mother seated at the kitchen table, her shoulders shaking. She's holding a photograph of Moira as a child, arms covered in paint, smiling wide, beside an easel that's 3 times her size. In the next room, her father moves without speaking. He locks the front door, latches a window, adjusts a curtain with mechanical care. His face is unreadable, a man building walls around his grief. A close-up on Moira's hand. It twitches once, then tightens into a fist. Not in anger, not even in fear, in defense. A preemptive reflex, as if her own presence in this world required shielding. Her gaze shifts slowly toward the window. Outside, the red rain dances against the glass like static on an old television screen. It doesn't fall in drops, but drifts swirling in air currents alive, in ways no one can name. And somehow through it all, the world seems muffled. There are no birds, no dogs barking, just the red, the red, the red. Flashback slices in, not with clarity, but like a wound being remembered, a hallway in a high school. Someone shouts behind her. She turns, her cheeks burning. Laughter. Sharp cracking. She's clutching a sketchbook to her chest. A voice calls her name, not kindly, back to the present. Her breath shallows. She rises, no announcement, no glance to her parents. She moves like a figure in a dream, opens the hall closet, pulls down a faded green backpack, pauses, then reaches for the small wooden box on the shelf above. Inside, a set of oil pastels, a collection of charcoals wrapped in tissue paper, and a folded piece of paper, a drawing of a horse white against a storm. She stares at it for a second too long, then folds it again, places it deep within the backpack, zips it shut. In the kitchen, her mother looks up. The sobs have stopped, replaced by that primal awareness mothers carry like a sixth sense. Moira. But there is no response. Just the creak of a door closing gently, like someone trying not to wake a ghost. By the time they realize she's gone, she's already disappeared into the trees. The forest looms old and waiting. Just outside town, it has always been there, silent, sacred, unsettling. The elders called it the Back Hollow. Children grew up with stories of it swallowing people whole. The red mist has reached here too. It coils around trunks, clings to moss, makes the air thick and unfamiliar. Moira walks without hesitation. Her boots crush wet leaves and forgotten bones of autumn. Each step feels heavy, but sure. She doesn't know where she's going, only that it isn't back. A deer watches her from behind a tree, unmoving. Its eyes mirror hers. She walks deeper, past the rusted fence where the old stable used to be. Past the stone with names carved into it, names no one speaks anymore. Her breath quickens. Not from exertion, but from the pounding inside her chest. It's not fear. It's knowing. A knowing she hasn't put words to. The further she goes, the quieter the world becomes. Even the red mist thins, or maybe it merges with her now. Maybe she carries it. She stops at a clearing, just for a moment. Listens. No wind, no sound. Then softly in the distance, a rhythmic sound. Dull, steady. Hooves. Moira doesn't turn, doesn't flinch. She just closes her eyes and smiles, not joyfully, but like someone who's finally found the edge of a dream they've been circling their whole life. Back in the house, her father slams the door open, raincoat flapping like a broken flag. She's not in her room. Her mother stares at the empty chair in the studio, where the canvas still waits. She whispers, "She took the paints." They look at each other, a moment of dread blooming between them. Outside, the rain thickens again, and far away, someone swears they saw a flash of white against the rooftops, too fast for the eye to follow, but undeniable. A horse, silent, running. Under the blood-stained canopy of the Vancouver sky, time began to unravel. By 7:03 a.m., the silence in Moira's house had grown unbearable. Her mother's voice, thin as paper, echoed through the empty rooms. Moira. No answer. No creaking of floorboards, no brush strokes scratching the canvas in the studio, just the sound of the red rain whispering against the windows, unrelenting. At 7:12 a.m., her father kicked the back door open, mud on his shoes, heart galloping. The forest behind the house gaped like an open mouth, waiting for him to shout into it. He did. Nothing answered. By 7:30, the first call to the local police was logged. The dispatcher asked the usual questions. What was she wearing? When did you last see her? The mother's voice cracked under each word. The father said nothing, just stared out the kitchen window like he was waiting for the trees to give her back. By 9:00, officers began combing the outskirts. A perimeter was set. Dogs brought in. Drones deployed. The red mist clinging to everything confused the thermal readings. Heat signatures bled into one another like watercolors on soaked paper. One officer muttered, "It's like this goddamn rain is alive." By noon, a crowd had gathered outside the house. Neighbors, classmates, 2 reporters with coffee-stained notepads. Someone lit a candle and placed it by the mailbox. Someone else muttered that the family had always been a little off. Someone else countered, "She was talented, though. The kid could draw." And then the words that stuck, "She's just like the others. These kids today, they snap. Can't handle a little pressure. Everyone wants to disappear now." The sentence floated in the air like a curse. No one challenged it. 2 miles from the search site, nestled deep within a grove of maple trees. Blackened by the dust, an old woman was adjusting the aperture of her weathered Leica. Lena, 65, skin like dry bark breath, slow as moss. Her cottage, if you could call it that, sat on a hill where no GPS dared to ping. The walls were covered in printed photographs, all black and white birds, mid-flight a fox curling into itself under snow, a child's hand reaching toward a cloud. The kind of images that weren't meant for galleries, but for memory itself. She stood barefoot on the porch, wrapped in a shawl camera to her eye. She wasn't aiming at the mist or the trees. She was waiting, and when it came, she knew. A flicker on the ridgeline. White. Not quite horse, not quite smoke. It didn't run. It glided. For a moment, the mist parted to give it passage. And then it was gone. She didn't lower her camera. Didn't need to. It wasn't meant to be captured. Some things weren't. Some things refused. She whispered to no one again, after all these years. Inside her cottage, on a mantel next to a framed photo of a teenage girl with dimples and a defiant smile, sat a newspaper clipping, "Local teen dies by suicide. Family declines to comment." Lena hadn't spoken her daughter's name aloud in over a decade. But now, the name returned to her lips uninvited. Leah, downtown, where the buildings wept rust and the buses dragged themselves through red sludge, a mural bloomed. A horse, white spectral, mid-gallop hooves tearing through a crimson wave. Its eye, painted in startling detail, stared straight out like it remembered everyone who ever looked at it. Standing 10 feet away, Ezra tapped the last stroke of shadow under the belly of the beast. He wore fingerless gloves, a threadbare jacket and headphones, blaring a lo-fi loop that barely masked the tremor in his hands. He stepped back, pulled out a can of black spray paint, and tagged a phrase in Cree under the image. Kyakako, the one who circles the lost. Pedestrians stopped and stared. One asked him what it meant. He didn't answer. Another said, "That thing again, everyone's painting that horse now." Ezra lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. His fingers still smelled like turpentine. He remembered the night before, remembered stepping into the intersection, remembered the bus barreling toward him like a train of steel and indifference, and remembered her, not a woman, a horse, white, still, in the center of the road where no animal should be. Eyes like tunnels, hooves resting on nothing and everything. The driver swerved. Ezra collapsed. He woke up on the sidewalk crying into his own palms. And then he began to paint, not to explain, to survive. By late afternoon, Moira's disappearance had saturated the local airwaves. Images of her flooded screens, her yearbook photo, her artwork from a school showcase, a grainy video of her laughing beside a bonfire. Reporters speculated. Online forums spun rumors. One theory claimed she joined a death cult. Another that she'd run off with a musician. The most persistent one. She followed the horse. Someone posted a blurry video of a pale shape moving across rooftops at dusk. The caption read, "It's real." Moira saw it. Now she's part of it. That night, Lena pulled out a shoebox she hadn't opened in years. Inside, dozens of letters her daughter wrote but never sent. A necklace she wore every day, and a small sketch of a white horse drawn in pen barely visible. Lena stared at it, hands shaking. She remembered Leah screaming into the wind that no one saw her, no one heard her, that even when she screamed, the world kept scrolling. And Lena had responded with silence. Now she whispered, "If she's out there, if that thing came for her too, then maybe it's not just death it carries." Across the city, Ezra climbed onto the rooftop of a condemned building and began painting again. The surface was uneven, broken by weather and time. Still, he worked through the tremor, painting the horse not in motion this time, but standing still, waiting. At its feet, he painted a girl, not clearly, just an outline, kneeling, head bowed. He sprayed another word below it, "Remain." As he capped his last can, he heard footsteps behind him. A boy, maybe 16, approached with wide eyes. "Are you the one painting the ghost horse?" Ezra nodded without looking. The boy hesitated, then asked, "Is it real?" Ezra lit another cigarette. "Does it matter?" Silence. Then the boy whispered, "My sister tried last year." She said something pulled her back. She never said what, just that it had hooves. Ezra's gaze didn't change, but he offered the boy a marker. "Add to it," he said, "whatever you saw." The boy began to draw. Back in the forest, the search waned. Volunteers called out Moira's name until their voices cracked. Dogs whined and tugged at leashes. A boot was found, hers, likely, but no prints, no blood, just the red. A search leader, grizzled and exhausted, muttered under his breath, "The forest's got her. She's gone." Her father heard that. He turned and punched a tree hard enough to bleed. Her mother sat on a stump, arms wrapped around herself, rocking slightly. The forest didn't answer, but overhead clouds began to thin, not to reveal the sun, but the stars. Early. Too early. And for a moment everyone paused, because they heard something, faint, rhythmic, like hooves, but no one saw anything. No one, except Lena. She'd come to the edge of the forest uninvited, holding her camera like a relic. She looked not at the trees, but at the silence between them, and she whispered, "You're not taking another one. Not unless you leave something behind." As if in answer, a gust of red dust swirled around her and vanished. She raised her camera, didn't click, just watched, waited, and began to follow. In the city, Ezra finished his rooftop piece and descended into the streets where people now stopped at his murals, not for selfies, but to pray. Some left notes. Some cried. Some brought paint. Something was happening, not organized, not named, but real. As real as Moira's absence, as real as the horse no one could explain. And as Ezra walked past an alley wall painted crimson, a child pointed and asked his mother, "Why does the horse look sad?" The mother didn't answer, because she couldn't, because she knew what it meant to disappear in plain sight, because she'd once seen her own reflection vanish behind her child's eyes, and she understood deeply, finally, that some ghosts wear hooves, and some miracles do too. The forest had stopped being forest. It no longer resembled the thing Moira had entered, the place that smelled of wet bark and memory, where her feet sank into leaves and the cold kissed her cheeks. That place had folded behind her like a closed book. This was something else. A suspended space. A hum inside her ribs. A place between places where no birds called and the trees didn't breathe. She had walked until walking stopped meaning anything, until her limbs moved without memory, until her thoughts became whispers she didn't recognize, and then she collapsed, not with drama. No scream, no grasping at the air. Her knees gave out the way old promises do. Her hands struck the mud with a sound like muffled applause, and her face met the red-soaked earth. Blackness followed, but not the comforting kind. Not sleep, not rest. The kind of black that peeled. When she opened her eyes, it was raining again. But this time, it wasn't falling. The mist hung in the air like frozen breath, suspended just above the surface of her skin. The color was deeper now. Less rust, more blood, more sacred. The light had gone strange too, bending at angles that didn't make sense. Like looking through glass that had once been a mirror, now melted into water. And it was silent. So silent her own heartbeat felt rude. Then, she saw it. Across the clearing just beyond the roots of a tree that looked older than Canada itself, it stood. A horse, white. Not the bleached white of snow or bone, but a white that pulsed, that dared the air around it to move. It didn't. The horse was still stiller than statues, but not lifeless. Its eyes were open, watching, or remembering. Its mane moved in the windless air as if gravity didn't apply here. Its hooves were caked in red dust, but the ground beneath them was untouched. It didn't belong, and yet it felt like it had always been there, like she had always known it. Moira pushed herself up, every bone in her body humming with protest. She stood wobbling. The earth swayed under her, unsure if it still recognized her as part of it. The horse didn't move, but it blinked once, and that blink said, "You're late." She didn't speak, didn't dare. There was no language here that wouldn't break everything. Then the horse lifted one hoof delicately, deliberately, and brought it down. Thud. The sound echoed like a heartbeat inside a cathedral. It lifted the second hoof. Thud. A pause. A third. Thud. 3 knocks. Not asking. Summoning. Moira took one step forward. Then another. The forest didn't respond. But her breath did. It came shorter, shallower, as if each exhale carried a decade of unspoken words. The horse turned, not dramatically, just enough to suggest movement. Then it walked. Slow, measured, dignified. Moira followed. She didn't wonder why. Didn't ask what would happen. She just knew this was the only direction left. The only thing that wasn't fear. The path didn't appear, it revealed. Each step took her not deeper into the forest, but somewhere else entirely. The colors around her blurred and shifted, but not like a dream. More like an old VHS tape warping with heat. Trees bent into angles that hurt to look at. Shadows moved independently of objects. Time refused to stack properly. She didn't just walk forward. She walked through, and the first memory opened like a wound. She was 9. In the living room of their first house, crayons scattered across the carpet, her hands sticky with purple and green. The television played softly in the background, some cartoon she wasn't paying attention to. All her focus was on the horse she was drawing. It had wings, though she'd never seen a Pegasus. Just imagined what it might feel like to fly without needing permission. She held the paper up proud, and then came the sound she would never forget. Her father's voice clipped, practical, surgical. "Why are you wasting time with that?" He didn't wait for her to answer. He grabbed the paper, glanced at it, and tore it in half with one flick of his wrist. Then he walked away. No rage, just rejection made casual. She watched the halves flutter to the ground like dying birds. The memory snapped back. Moira stumbled, gasping. The horse ahead of her didn't slow, only glanced back. Its eyes were red now, not from blood, but from reflection, from having carried too many stories. She steadied herself, followed. Second memory. She was 12, standing at the edge of the school gymnasium, wearing a dress she didn't choose. Her mother had braided her hair too tightly. The room smelled like sweat and polish and expectation. Parents filled the rows of folding chairs. The art teacher gestured toward the easel at center stage, where Moira's painting stood lit from above. It was a chaotic, swirling depiction of a storm. No figures, no horizon, just motion. It made her feel proud, brave. Then the boy from her math class snickered. "What is it? Did your cat throw up on the paper?" Laughter followed. Her cheeks burned. Her knees shook. She wanted to melt into the floor. The applause at the end of the show sounded like pity. Back in the present, Moira clenched her fists. She tasted the same bitterness on her tongue. The horse ahead of her turned slightly, and for the first time she noticed its side bore scars. Faint, crisscrossing, not drawn, not painted, etched, as if it had walked through fire to get here. She stepped closer. So did the next memory. 15. the day she was accepted into the fine arts program at her top choice college. She burst into the kitchen, paper in hand. Her mother was chopping carrots, her father reading the paper. She read the letter aloud, tears of joy already brimming. Then her father's voice again, flat, unimpressed. What about accounting? You said you'd apply to the business track too. She hadn't. She wouldn't. But she lied. Said she did. Said she didn't get in. Her mother sighed. Her father folded the newspaper and said, well, maybe next year. That night she burned the acceptance letter in the sink. Her tears turned to steam. Back in the forest, she collapsed, hands gripping moss. The horse waited. Still, she whispered, why are you showing me this? But there was no answer, only the sound of water dripping from unseen leaves. Then came the worst one, the one she hadn't dared to think about in months. 17. The last conversation with Avery, her best friend. Her anchor, Avery had called sobbing. Said she couldn't do it anymore. Said the meds weren't working. That everything felt like static. Moira, caught in her own storm, told her she'd call back. She didn't. That night, Avery died. A note left behind, folded neatly, addressed to no one. Moira never opened it. She couldn't. In the memory, she saw herself on her bed staring at the phone. A missed call blinking like a heartbeat. Her fingers numb. Her mind a cave. She reached toward her past self, tried to scream. But she had no voice here. Only the horse could hear her. And it didn't judge, didn't flinch. It turned its head gently and nuzzled her shoulder. A gesture without words, but with weight. She sobbed, bent forward until her forehead touched the forest floor. The red mist swirled around her like an embrace. She let it. She let everything go. For a moment, when she looked up, they were in a clearing. One she didn't recognize, or maybe she had in another life. There were paintings hung from trees, her paintings, from childhood, from high school, from the times she dared to create. Each one fluttered in a wind that wasn't wind. At the center of the clearing, a mirror, old, cracked, framed in wood that looked alive. The horse walked toward it. Moira followed. She stared at the reflection. At first she saw nothing, then herself, but not the version she knew, not the version she presented. This Moira was wild. Hair tangled, hands stained with color, eyes fierce, free, untouched by shame. She reached out. The mirror didn't resist, but it didn't give. The horse stepped beside her, lowered its head. Its breath fogged the glass. For a moment, both their reflections merged. One creature, one story, one scar. Moira turned to it, touched its face. Am I dead? She asked. No answer, just eyes. Knowing, her own reflection nodded. The horse lifted its hoof, stomped once, twice, 3 times. The ground trembled. The sky cracked. And then, darkness again. But this time, she wasn't afraid of it. The clearing had vanished. Moira now walked through a corridor of trees so tightly pressed together, they seemed to breathe. Red mist seeped between the trunks, curling at her feet like searching hands. The forest no longer resembled nature. It was becoming architecture. A theater carved from shadow and grief, built not from wood and earth, but from memory itself. And in this place, memory didn't wait to be remembered. It rose like smoke, thick and inescapable. The horse walked beside her now, no longer leading, just present. Like it knew what was coming, like it had seen it 1,000 times before. Moira stepped onto a floor of stone, cracked and glowing faintly beneath the dust. Each step she took echoed not into space, but into time. Then came the sound, not external, internal. A voice, his voice. It didn't crash like thunder. It slid beneath her skin, familiar as the scent of old coffee and wet newspapers. She turned and the scene unfolded before her. The kitchen, formica counters, a calendar pinned to the fridge with smiling apples. The radio murmuring a talk show no one listened to. Her father stood near the window. Sleeves rolled up tie loosened the expression on his face, somewhere between exhaustion and irritation. He held a paper in one hand. Her paper. A painting, one she'd worked on for days. A portrait of a woman made entirely of smoke and light. Her hands were wings, her mouth stitched shut. She remembered what she'd wanted it to say. This is how it feels to be looked at, but never seen. But her father didn't see that. He saw impracticality. He saw failure in progress. You want to survive off this? He asked, tapping the canvas like it had insulted him. Moira, 16, in this memory, stood in the doorway, backpack still on one shoulder, hands trembling. Art is communication, she had whispered. It's how I understand things. Her father snorted. Understand what you want to starve on a sidewalk while you're understanding yourself. He folded the canvas in half. Crack! The sound still lived in her spine. He didn't throw it away. He didn't burn it. He just left it on the counter. Dismissed. Collapsed. Her mother entered then. Quiet. Always quiet. She picked up the painting, eyes lingering on it, not in admiration, but in worry. She looked at Moira, then at her husband, and without a word she walked into the garage and tucked the broken canvas behind the old lawn chairs. like a secret, like shame. Moira had watched her do it standing still, holding her breath so tightly she thought her ribs would snap. Back in the forest, Moira fell to her knees. The horse stepped forward but did not touch her. Its breath steamed into the air like incense. Moira pressed her hands to her eyes. But the memory didn't care. It kept going. Now she was 10, a bright spring afternoon. The elementary classroom smelled of glue sticks and chalk dust. On the wall, laminated posters of animals smiled too wide. A hamster wheel squeaked faintly from the corner cage. She sat at her tiny desk, tongue peeking between her teeth, in concentration coloring something with all the ferocity of a surgeon stitching a heart. A white horse, large, regal, eyes red with emotion, standing in a field of red rain. She didn't know where the image came from. She just knew it, felt it, breathed it. She added the final detail, a streak of crimson down the horse's shoulder. Not gore, not violence, just truth. The teacher passed by a tall man with too much cologne and a voice like rusted scissors. He stopped, stared, and said with a half laugh, "This is disturbing." Moira looked up confused. "It's not. It's just raining." He frowned. "That's blood." "No," she said, blinking. It's memory." He took the page from her desk, ripped it right down the center. "Try drawing something normal," he said, tossing the pieces into the trash like they were rotted fruit. She didn't cry. She just stared at her empty hands. Back in the forest, Moira curled into herself. The red rain fell heavier now, dense as syrup. Her skin burned under it. Not pain, but exposure. Like everything she'd buried was being pulled to the surface. The horse stood beside her, silent, but something had changed. Its eyes, they shimmered now, not just with red, but with recognition. Like it had stood in front of that teacher once. Like it had watched something sacred be shredded. Moira pushed herself to her feet, clothes clinging, hair slicked to her forehead, breath shallow. She took one step, then another. Each one felt like betrayal. Each one a step back into everything she had tried to forget. She wanted to run, wanted to disappear again. But the forest offered no direction, only truth. A new space unfolded. A studio, dim, smelling of oil and sweat and desperation. College, easel in front of her, a blank canvas, her fingers twitching. But she didn't move, didn't paint, not anymore. The room echoed with the voice of her professor. "You're not pushing yourself. You've plateaued." And worse, the whisper from a classmate behind her. She only got in because her dad's connected. Moira stood frozen. Every idea she'd ever loved began to rot in her mind. Color turned to mud. Motion became mess. She stopped painting that day. Not publicly, not even in sketchbooks. She told herself she was on pause, but it was grief. The kind that doesn't throw flowers. The kind that waits until your hands forget how to hold a brush. In the present, Moira stumbled forward, her legs coated in red muck. The rain had stopped falling, but now clung to her in waves. She fell, face first, into a pool of crimson. Thick, viscous, the color of screams. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Her voice stripped, not by force, by abandonment. She clawed at the mud, dragging herself forward like a soldier over barbed memory. Her eyes burned, her face no longer hers, distorted by failure, disappointment, the endless echoes of not enough. Then, a hoof, in front of her, solid, white. The horse had not moved, had not flinched, just waited. Moira reached for it, not with grace, with desperation. Her fingers found its leg, and for a moment clarity. The world exhaled. The red mist lifted just slightly. She gasped. A sound raw, jagged escaped her lips. It wasn't a word. It was a birth of something old and something entirely new. She sat up slowly, mud sloughing off her skin like old versions of herself. The horse lowered its head. Their eyes met, and in those eyes, she saw the child she had been, the teenager she had survived, the woman she was becoming. Not perfect, but intact, bruised, but breathing. She rose. The rain did not stop, but it no longer soaked. It baptized. The forest began to pulse, not with sound, but with memory reclaimed. Around her, figures flickered, ghosts of her past. Watching, not accusing, just witnessing. She walked through them, one by one. Her father holding a ripped painting, her teacher blinking in confusion, her mother burying a canvas, then looking back. Avery smiling, not the last smile, but the one from before, the one that forgave. Moira didn't reach for them. She didn't need to. She walked, and with each step, the horse at her side shimmered brighter, not glowing, just true, as if every scar on its body was a map, and every step it took was a promise. That pain remembered is not pain wasted. That expression denied is violence. That creation, no matter how quiet, is survival. They reached the edge of a hill. Beneath it, a valley of red mist and old trees, but above sky, cracked, light pushing through, not warm, but real. The horse stopped. Moira did too. They stood together, both stained, both silent, both whole in a way that required breaking. She placed her hand on its neck. Its breath hitched just slightly, a sound like recognition. Then it turned, walked away. No drama, no goodbye, just distance and understanding. Moira watched it vanish into the mist, then looked down at her own hands. stained red. She smiled, not in triumph, in relief, because they were hers again, because they still worked, because they still wanted to. She turned, faced the forest, faced herself, and took a step forward, not into memory, but into what came next. The mist around her thickened like breath held too long. The forest had shifted again. The red light that had previously glowed like a wound now pulsed slower, more rhythmic, as though Moira had stepped inside the lungs of something ancient. It no longer tried to terrify her. It only waited. Waited for her to see what she had come to see. The ground beneath her feet was firmer now. Stone, not soil. Cold stone cracked by time and shaped into something vaguely architectural. Not natural, not man-made. Something in between. As if the forest, moved by what she had remembered, had grown a new organ just for this reckoning. The horse had disappeared again. She was alone. Except she wasn't. There was a door ahead. Black, splintered, wide open. She walked through it. The studio was a ruin. Ceiling beams sagged. Shattered windows let in the low hum of the red mist. The floor was layered with broken glass, abandoned canvases, paint cracked dry in forgotten pallets. The space looked ransacked, but no one had looted it. It had been emptied by time, by indifference, by someone who had given up long ago. She knew this place, knew it in her bones, even though she had never been here before. It was hers, her studio, in some version of the future, in some timeline where nothing was salvaged. And at the center of it, her body, hanging. Moira stopped. Her heart split open not from fear, but from recognition. That was her. Not metaphor, not symbolism. It was her. Still her feet moved forward, slowly, each step breaking something inside her. She reached the edge of the frame where she could see the color of her own skin turning to ash. The line of bruising along her neck, the blue-tinted fingernails. A sound tried to form in her throat, but choked itself back. Her reflection in the broken glass, staring at her from two places at once, the girl standing and the girl gone. Then, from the shadows behind her, a sound. A hoof. Soft, deliberate. The horse stepped into the space. Its coat white as ever, though its flanks were streaked now with red, like it had walked through her memories and borne the cost. It stood at the base of the beam, looked up, waited. Then, it lifted one leg and stomped. The echo rang like a judgment. Again. Stomp! Moira's breath caught. One final time. Stomp! The beam cracked not from impact, but from truth. The noose slipped. Her hanging self dropped slow, weightless, and turned to ash before touching the ground. Gone. Unwritten. Rewritten. Moira collapsed, hands over her face. Sobs tearing through her body like wildfire. She gasped, choking out a sound that had waited years to exist. I don't... Another breath. Then louder. I don't deserve to be here. The horse didn't move. She pressed her fist to her eyes. I don't have anything. I'm not... Enough. She shook her head, curled into herself. Her voice cracked into fragments. I never made anything real. I never helped anyone. I failed her. I failed Avery. I failed everything. Her voice dissolved into gasps. I have nothing to leave behind. And then silence. But not the silence of void. The silence of waiting. Of choice. Of what comes after truth. The horse stepped forward, bent its head. And its balm-drenched, now matted with red rain, brushed her hand. Just a touch. No weight. No force. But in that touch was everything. Moira froze. The sensation was electric. Not warm. Not cold. Not comforting. But cleansing. The kind of touch that doesn't erase pain, but names it, validates it. The kind of touch that says, you are not unmade by suffering. You are forged by it. Her eyes fluttered open, and she saw, not through her vision, but through the blood-drenched film of every memory she'd carried. Around her the air began to shift, swirl, melted memories, paintings that had once hung in her mind, as regrets now uncurled into light. Her mother crying behind a closed door. Her father standing in the hallway longer than he ever admitted, holding one of her old sketches in shaking hands. Her teacher years later speaking about her drawing in a lecture on misunderstood creativity. She saw Avery again, but not the last moment. Avery in the park laughing so hard she spilled coffee on her jeans. Avery on a rooftop naming stars that didn't exist. Avery painting her nails black and blue. And saying, it doesn't matter what they see, only what you mean. Moira sobbed harder. But this time the sobs weren't knives. They were release. Rain began to fall again, but not like before. Not in anger, not in menace. It fell gently, as if time itself were trying to rinse the pain from her skin. Red rain. It slid down her face, mingling with her tears, until the distinction was impossible. And with every drop, a memory surrendered its weight. Not gone, not forgotten, transformed. The horse raised its head. Its mane dripped onto the stone floor, leaving stains that bloomed like flowers. It turned, faced her. Moira sat upright, eyes open, breathing. Truly breathing for the first time since she was 9. I don't know how to live, she said. I don't know what to do. The horse tilted its head, not to answer, but to say you're already doing it, because she had spoken. because she had cried, because she had stayed. The studio around her began to crack not violently, but reverently. The walls folded like tired paper. The windows melted into dusk. The beam where she had once been hung dissolved into mist. And from the floor where her shadow had trembled for so long, flowers began to grow. Not beautiful, not symmetrical, but real. She stood, her knees shaking, but they held. The horse stepped back into the mist. Its body began to fade, not in color, but in form, becoming less horse, more symbol, less being, more bridge. Moira stepped forward, one hand over her heart, the other reaching. "Thank you," she whispered. The mist swirled, and the horse was gone, but the echo of its hooves remained, soft, endless, like a lullaby only the broken can hear. Moira stepped out of the studio, back into the forest, or what was left of it. The trees had shifted again, now towering, not oppressive, inviting, not blinding. The red mist cleared a path just wide enough for her. She walked, hands open, face bare, no longer running, no longer hiding. And behind her, where she had stood where the rope had once dangled, the stone bloomed with red flowers, each one shaped like a hoofprint, each one a promise. The rain had stopped, not gradually, not with warning. It ended as if someone had exhaled for the final time, and the world had finally decided to listen. The red mist no longer hovered. It clung briefly to the branches, shimmered once in the early light, then melted into the soil like it had never been there. And Moira lay still at the center of it all, face turned to the sky, hands open, eyes half-lidded like someone just learning how to be awake again. The silence that surrounded her wasn't hollow. It was sacred, reverent. The wind had returned, soft, curious. She blinked slowly. Then again, breath entered her chest with effort, as if she were borrowing lungs from some older version of herself. The kind who had learned how to survive this world long before she remembered wanting to. A bird called in the distance, one note. She moved, barely, a flutter in her fingers, a twitch in her ankle, the tilt of her head toward the light. Something rested in her palm. It took a long moment for her to see it. The world was still not quite the world. Shapes existed, but names had not returned yet. Time had become liquid. Only sensation remained. But her hand told her the truth. It was fabric, torn, stained, a deep bleeding red. A single patch of cloth, maybe once part of a sleeve, or a banner, or a curtain. But now just fragment. Its edges were frayed, and near the center, clear as ink, sat a symbol, a hoofprint. Not heavy, not bruising, delicate, like a mark pressed into skin, not out of force, but contact. Like something had stood beside her while she was not herself, and had left a reminder. You were here. You made it back. Her hand closed around it slowly, her fingers trembling from exhaustion, not fear. Tears came then, not the howling ones of earlier, not the explosive sobs of trauma, but quiet ones, grieving ones. Grief not for what had happened, but for what she had almost never come back to. She sat up. The forest didn't shudder. It welcomed her. The trees looked less like sentinels now, more like witnesses, survivors. Some of them bore the marks of the red rain patches of color on bark, on leaves, like old scars. But they stood, just like her. Her knees wobbled beneath her. Her boots were soaked. Her clothes clung to her like second skin. She rose not in triumph, but necessity. There was no ceremony in this moment. No sudden anthem, only breath. And the sense that this finally was her body again. She looked around for the horse, but it was gone. No hoofprints, no breath in the air, no shimmer on the leaves. Just her, and that was enough. The walk back wasn't fast. It couldn't be. Every step forward was a negotiation between body and spirit. Muscles that hadn't moved in what felt like a century protested. But her will had changed. She was no longer walking to escape anything. She was walking because the world needed to know she was still here. Birds had returned to the trees, small ones flitting nervously between branches. The sky above had cleared, though a faint pink haze still hovered at the horizon, like the edge of a dream refusing to fully die. She moved through it all. Mud-stained hair, wild hands clenched to keep from shaking. As she neared the edge of the forest, she saw something strange. Silhouettes, people, standing, frozen. They had seen her first. Word spread before voices did. First a gasp, then a shout, then silence again. Her mother was the first to move. No scream, no sprint. She just stepped forward, hands covering her mouth, eyes wide. Moira stopped. Her mother stopped. Their eyes met across 20 feet and 17 years. Then her mother ran, not gracefully, not theatrically, desperately, as if the earth might steal Moira again at any second. They collided like waves. No words, no questions. Her mother wrapped her arms around her like a bandage, like a shield, like a prayer. Her father stood a few steps behind. Not cold, just undone. His eyes redder than the sky couldn't meet hers. Not yet. He looked down, at her feet, at the fabric in her hand. then at the mud on her clothes. When he looked up, it wasn't recognition. It was apology. But Moira said nothing, and neither did he, because some forgiveness is not spoken. It's seen. They brought her inside, gave her water, let her sit on the same couch where she'd once hidden sketchbooks beneath the cushions. No one asked questions. No one dared. Not yet. Neighbors gathered outside. The police were notified. Someone called a local reporter. She said nothing. Her parents hovered, uncertain, wanting to hold her, but not sure they had the right. She sat still, not numb, present. And then just as her mother began to ask, "Do you remember anything they heard it?" Gasps, not from inside the house. From the crowd. Someone had turned toward the side of the home, pointed, whispered. Moira stood, walked slowly to the window, and saw it. The side wall of the house, once blank chipped beige paint, now bore an image. A mural, not spray paint, not chalk. Something older, more primal, as if the mist itself had stained the wall with meaning. A white horse, still, silent, standing in the rain. Its mane moved slightly in an invisible wind. Its eyes were open, not sad, not glad, just aware. It looked exactly like the one in her memories, exactly like the one in the forest. But no one had painted it. No one could say who had made it. Some said it had appeared overnight. Others insisted it had always been there. Someone tried to take a photo, but the camera wouldn't focus. The image blurred, shifted, refused capture. Moira walked outside. The crowd parted. She stood before the mural. Close enough to see the faint outline of something behind the horse. Not letters, not words. A shape. A circle, unfinished, like an invitation. She touched the wall. It was dry, solid, but warm, as if something lived just beneath the surface. A small girl stepped forward from the crowd, held her mother's hand tightly. She asked, "Is that your horse?" Moira didn't answer right away. Then softly, "No." The girl blinked. "Then whose is it?" Moira smiled, a small, tired, real smile. "It belongs to anyone who needs it." The girl seemed to understand more than the adults did. She nodded and stepped back. Moira sat on the grass, let the sun touch her face. It was the first warmth she'd felt in weeks, maybe longer. And behind her on the wall of the house that had once silenced her, the horse remained. Still, watching, unmoving, unshakable, like memory, like myth, like something reborn. Moira didn't speak for the first 7 days. She returned to the house, slept, ate little, stared at nothing. Her parents didn't push her. They moved around her like shadows, present, quiet, reverent. The red dust still clung to her fingernails. It didn't wash off easily, as if the forest had marked her in some invisible language. But she breathed. She woke up. She stayed. That was enough. On the 8th day, she entered the garage. It was still how she remembered it. The smell of turpentine and rust. Old furniture stacked in corners. Forgotten cardboard boxes labeled in faded marker. And there behind the lawn chairs and a stack of holiday decorations, it waited. The painting, the one her mother had hidden all those years ago. The woman made of smoke and light. Hands like wings. Mouth stitched shut. Moira pulled it out. Looked at it. Didn't cry. Didn't smile. Just studied it like she'd never seen it before. Then without hesitation, she set it down, found a canvas, a brush, opened a jar of crimson paint, and began. She didn't announce anything, didn't explain, didn't even change her clothes. Every morning she entered the garage and painted, sometimes for 3 hours, sometimes until her knees gave out. She didn't start small. She started enormous. 6-foot canvases, sprawling sheets of unstretched linen stapled to the walls. Every surface became a confession. Her brushstrokes were furious, sweeping, primal, but never chaotic. Everything had rhythm, had structure. It wasn't technique. It was testimony. She painted horses, of course she did. But not just horses. She painted storms with hooves, silhouettes caught mid-gallop against blood-colored skies. She painted beasts dissolving into ash, then reappearing in reflections. She painted the sound of a hoof hitting stone, the silence afterward. She painted the same white figure over and over, but never the same way twice. Each one spoke a different language. Loneliness, guilt, resurrection. Some of the canvases bore no horses at all, just streaks of red and white like lightning and breath crashing together. She didn't stop. She couldn't. The neighbors heard music again. Not from speakers, from motion. The rhythm of brush on canvas, the shudder of ladders dragged across the floor. Sometimes she screamed while she worked. Sometimes she wept. Mostly she painted in silence. The town began to talk. Whispers turned to questions. Questions turned to awe. Then one morning, without warning, she opened the garage doors and let them in. It wasn't a formal gallery. It was concrete and dust and sweat. But the line stretched around the block. People stood in silence. They didn't know what they were waiting for. Only that they needed to be here. There was no sign, no brochure, no statement. Just a handwritten note on a piece of canvas nailed above the doorway. The horse that has no name. The horse without a name. Inside, light filtered in through makeshift skylights, holes in the roof covered with plastic. It painted every piece with a soft golden haze. Visitors walked slowly, reverently, as if navigating a church built from the aftermath of something beautiful and broken. Children stared. Old men wept. Teenagers took photos, then slowly lowered their phones, unable to explain what they were feeling. There was one painting at the very back, larger than the others, titled in tiny red letters, "The Day I Stayed." It showed no horse, just a single figure seated on a stone in the middle of a forest rain, turning to fire around her. Her face was obscured by her hands, but in the shadows behind her, barely visible, was the curve of a white mane. Waiting, watching, still. A boy, maybe 7 years old, stood in front of it for a long time. His mother reached for his shoulder, but he spoke first. "Mom," he whispered, "I saw that horse." She blinked. "When?" "In my dream." She knelt. "What dream, sweetie?" He didn't look away from the painting. It was outside my window. It didn't move, just looked at me. His mother looked rattled, but he smiled. I think it was helping me. She didn't answer. Couldn't. There were no words to hold that moment, only silence and breath and knowing. From across the street, Lena watched, not from the line, not from inside. She sat on a folding chair, camera in her lap, pointed at nothing. She didn't need to photograph it. Some things are not for capturing. They're for witnessing. Beside her, Ezra leaned against a wall, hands in his pockets. His boots were caked with paint. The alley behind him bore his latest mural, a white horse, mouth open, mid-scream, eyes filled with galaxies. Beneath it, his signature, Kiakakal. He didn't look at the crowd, just lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and muttered. She didn't run from it. Lena nodded. She turned around. Ezra grinned and brought it back. They sat there a while, not saying much. The city moved around them. Cars passed. Dogs barked. The wind shifted. But something had changed. The fear was different now, softer. Like maybe the town wasn't haunted anymore. Maybe it was held. In the following weeks, murals began to appear all over Vancouver. Not just Moira's, not just Ezra's. People started painting them. On dumpsters, on school walls, on the backs of street signs. The horse-white silent undefined became a language. Some drew it standing still. Some mid-flight. Some with wings. Others with eyes like moons. No two were the same, but all of them meant the same thing. You're not alone in this. Mental health centers started getting postcards, handmade sketches of horses tucked into envelopes with no return address. An anonymous donor sent boxes of brushes and paint to struggling high school art departments. Therapists reported a spike in teenagers referencing the white horse during sessions. Some said they saw it in dreams, others in moments of near collapse. One said, "It didn't save me. It just stayed with me," which sometimes is enough. Moira gave no interviews. She refused all press. When asked about the horse, she simply said, "It doesn't belong to me." She opened a second show 3 months later. This one outdoors. Dozens of canvas banners strung between the trees in a local park. People walked beneath them like pilgrims. One had a single sentence painted across it in black. Some pain needs to be seen to become something else. The horse appeared again, this time surrounded by children. Each one holding a paintbrush, each one adding color. It was not sacred anymore. It was shared. Lena finally approached her at dusk one evening. The garage was still open, but quiet. No visitors, just Moira sitting cross-legged on the floor, scraping dried paint off her palms. Lena entered without knocking. They didn't speak for a long while. Then Lena said softly, "My daughter drew horses too." Moira looked up. "I know," she said. Silence. Then Lena added, "I thought they were her escape." Moira's voice cracked. "They were." Another pause. Then, "But maybe they were also a map." Lena smiled, then sat beside her. And they painted in silence until the sun was gone. Ezra showed up the next morning, dropped a can of spray paint at Moira's feet. "Want to do one together?" She blinked. "A wall." He shrugged. "A church." She laughed. He didn't. "I'm serious." She tilted her head. He said, "Abandoned. On Powell Street. Empty 30 years. What's there?" Ezra lit a cigarette. "Enough ghosts to make something holy." Moira smiled and stood. 3 days later, the city woke to find the old stone church entirely transformed, every inch covered. Not in tags, not in vandalism. In memory. Red, white, gold, black. Images of horses, wings, children, broken clocks, stitched, mouths open, eyes, falling feathers. And across the entire roof, in massive lettering visible from blocks away, "You made it back." No one tore it down. No one painted over it. Not even the city. Because deep down, everyone knew. It had always been there, just waiting to be seen. At first, the letters came slowly. Folded slips of paper left at the base of a painting. Torn notebook pages wedged beneath the corner of a canvas. Envelopes addressed to no one, sealed in trembling hands. Moira never asked for them. She never opened them at first either. She let them pile in a weathered wooden box she kept in the back of the studio next to her brushes and beneath the jar of dried crimson paint. But over time, something shifted. One morning after a night of rain, she found a small card taped to the gallery door. Cheap cardstock. Blue ink. The handwriting jagged like it had been written too fast. "I was going to do it yesterday. I had the note and everything." Then I saw the one with the girl sitting on the stone. The one with the rain turning to fire. And I don't know why, but I cried. Then I didn't do it. There was no signature, no return address. Just that. Moira held the card for a long time. Then she opened the box. Read every single letter. Each one felt like a hand reaching up from the deep. From mothers grieving their children. From widowers who hadn't spoken aloud in years. From teenagers who'd run away and come back. From veterans. From teachers. From nurses. From prisoners. From strangers. The theme wasn't just survival. It was recognition. They had seen themselves in the white horse, in the red rain, in her hands, in her silence. You gave me something I didn't have a word for. Thank you for showing me the shape of pain. Now I know it isn't mine alone. I didn't know it could be beautiful. Some wrote entire pages, others just a sentence. But they all shared one message. I stayed. Soon the white horse began to appear where no paintbrush had gone. Bus stops, overpass pillars, inside hospital waiting rooms, the back walls of shelters, the side of a women's prison in Burnaby. It was never vandalism. It was reverence. No one claimed authorship. No one ever saw it being painted. It just appeared, sometimes in chalk, sometimes in soot, sometimes in condensation on cold windows drawn by a child's fingertip. At St. Martin's psychiatric ward, a nurse found one etched into a patient's bedside journal, along with a phrase scribbled beneath it. It stood outside my mind until I let it in. And then in Montreal, in Toronto, even across the border. In Seattle and Juneau, people began sharing the image online. Dozens of variations. Same shape, same silence. A movement without a manifesto. A language without a name. The media tried to catch up. Podcasts speculated. Was this performance art a campaign? An AI hallucination? Some guerrilla project led by a collective? One article asked, is the white horse the Banksy of grief? But the answer didn't come from scholars. It came from a 5-minute clip that went viral on a rainy Tuesday. A high school student named Rio had filmed it on his cracked phone during a downtown protest about mental health services being slashed. The video was shaky, but it showed something unforgettable. Hundreds of students gathered beneath a bridge, rain pouring, a girl standing on a concrete platform soaked, holding a sign that simply read, "We're not broken, we're unspoken." Behind her in bold white strokes, a new mural of the horse had appeared overnight, this time with wings, but they were clipped. Someone in the crowd lit a flare. The red light flooded the space, and in that glow, the camera caught the girl turning toward the horse and whispering, "You waited for us." That was all. But the clip reached 3 million views in 48 hours. Reporters descended. Requests flooded Moira's inbox. Book deals, documentaries, an exhibit in New York. She declined them all. She didn't need to speak. The work had already found its voice. And it was louder, purer than anything she'd ever said out loud. One late evening, a local news program aired a brief segment titled The Red Rain 1 year later. It featured scientists, meteorologists, skeptics. Most agreed on the explanation, a bizarre mix of pollen drift, desert dust, and atmospheric pressure. A once-in-a-century event. Nothing supernatural, nothing mysterious. But in the last 10 seconds of the segment, a weatherman retired. Tired, half-smiling, leaned back in his chair, shook his head, and muttered, "Listen, I've studied pressure systems for 30 years. But I'm telling you, if a horse in that rain made one kid stay alive another day, then maybe it knew what it was doing." The clip went semi-viral. Someone subtitled it in 17 languages. Someone else turned the quote into street art. Moira saw it spray-painted behind a train station in Calgary 2 weeks later. She didn't smile. She just stood there for 10 minutes in the cold, then walked away. On the anniversary of her return, Moira opened her last show. No press, no announcement, just a small warehouse by the docks. Inside 24 canvases, all black and white. No titles, no themes, only one rule, no phones. Visitors entered in silence, took off their shoes, and walked through the space like a church made of undoing. At the end of the gallery, there was a mirror, full length, unframed, no plaque. But someone had written on it, in faint chalk, "The horse was never outside you." People didn't take selfies. They wept, and left behind feathers, coins, and scraps of ribbon in the corner like offerings. That same week, in a rehabilitation center on the edge of town, a 17-year-old boy sketched a horse on the wall of his room. He told his counselor, "I saw it when I was in the bathtub, not in the water, in the tile. It was looking at me." He didn't take the pills that night. He asked for a brush instead. In a prison cell in Abbotsford, an inmate wrote a letter he couldn't send. "When I first saw it, I thought it was something to fear. But it didn't move. Just stared at me like it knew I wasn't what I did. Like it remembered who I was before the noise." He drew the horse in ash on the wall and let himself cry. And in a children's hospital downtown, a little girl recovering from surgery pointed to the corner of the ceiling and whispered to her nurse, "It's back." "What is?" the nurse asked. The girl smiled sleepily. "My horse. The quiet one." The city began changing in ways no policy could track. Mental health centers reported more walk-ins. Art programs gained new funding. Mural permits were approved without pushback. Graffiti cleanup crews started sparing the horses. No one admitted why. They just did. As if there was something sacred in that shape, in that silence. Moira still painted. Not for galleries, not for shows, just to feel her hands move again, to remember her breath. Sometimes people would pass her on the street and nod, not with recognition, but gratitude. The kind that doesn't require knowing someone's name. The kind that comes from having seen something holy in a ruined place, and still believing in its return. She never explained the horse, not even to herself, because it didn't need explaining. It needed continuing, so she painted. Others followed, and the city, once silent in its grief, learned to speak again, one hoofprint at a time. The world had turned the color of wine, not blood, not dusk. Something in between, like the sky was remembering every wound it had ever held and finally learning how to name it. Clouds moved slowly overhead, thick with memory. The air shimmered. Not hot, not cold. Suspended. The girl stood near the edge of the platform. Shoes too thin for winter. Hoodie soaked at the cuffs. Her backpack sat behind her like a forgotten version of herself. The train hadn't come yet, but she could hear it, feel it, like thunder on the inside. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She just stood there, utterly still, the way someone stands when there's no longer a reason to move forward or back. As if time had paused just for her and she hadn't decided whether to press play or not. The rails stretched out endlessly in front of her silver veins, running into the dark. Everything was too quiet. Then came the sound. Subtle, unmistakable. A drip. She blinked and looked down. A puddle had formed near her foot. Shallow, clear. She stared at it. And then, something shifted. In the water, a ripple formed, not from her movement, from presence. And there, in the trembling surface, it appeared, a hoofprint, pressed softly. Perfectly. As if something invisible had stepped beside her, not to stop her, not to speak. Just to be there. She inhaled sharply, eyes widened, and suddenly everything inside her that had been locked down began to rise. Her shoulders shook, her knees wobbled. But she didn't fall. She turned, just enough to see the sky behind her, and what she saw made her forget how to breathe. The red was rising. Dust. Fine. Crimson, like the first rain all over again. But this time, it wasn't falling. It was lifting. Upward, as if the world had changed its mind about gravity, about grief. Tiny particles reversed direction and floated skyward, slow, elegant, like time undoing itself. Rain falls backwards, like sorrow learning how to become something else. She watched, mouth open. The puddle at her feet shimmered. The hoofprint remained. The train never came. She stepped back, took a breath, then another, and walked away. In a small gallery on the east side of the city, Moira sat by the window. Paint stained her fingers again, not from compulsion, from joy. She watched the dust rise, watched the light catch on the particles like glitter in reverse, and she smiled. Not wide, not performative, but true, like someone who had carried death, set it down, and now carried light in its place. Her reflection blurred against the glass. Her voice came soft, layered over the quiet. I used to think I deserved to die. But then, the horse taught me how to live. Her eyes shimmered, not with sadness, with something that looked suspiciously like peace. Final frame, the city skyline. A white horse painted across a rooftop in brushstrokes you can only see from above. A mural you'd miss unless you were looking for it. The red dust continues to rise, and the voice returns. Not everyone who sees the white horse survives. But no one who survives after seeing it ever walks the world the same again. Fade to black.